was horrified by the deaths, but the police didn't seem to be too horrified because it was basically biker gangs cleaning house.
By the summer of 1995, two biker gangs had been quietly slaughtering each other across the province of Quebec for a year, fighting for control of the streets, and the public had barely noticed because the only people dying were the ones who had signed up for it. Then a car bomb went off on a Montreal street. It was meant for a drug dealer, but the blast tore across the road and struck an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrocher. His death forced an entire province to finally see the war being fought in its streets, and nothing was ever the same again. But a bomb that kills a child came from a war that had been building for years, and it traced all the way back to 1985. This is the Quebec Biker War, the bloodiest gang conflict in Canadian history, and it began with a club killing its own. The war did not begin with the Hells Angels fighting a rival. It began with the Hells Angels killing themselves. By 1985, the club's Laval chapter north of Montreal had rotted from the inside, snorting the cocaine it was supposed to sell, stealing from other chapters, drawing police like a flare. The leadership decided the chapter would not be disciplined. It would be erased. They summoned the Laval men to a party at a fortified clubhouse in Lennoxville, and inside, other Hells Angels were waiting with guns. 5 men were shot dead, wrapped in sleeping bags, weighed down, and dropped into the St. Lawrence River. When police divers pulled the bodies out that summer, Quebec got its first real look at what the Hells Angels had become. Most of the underworld absorbed the massacre as business. One man could not. His name was Salvatore Cazzetta, a rising figure in Montreal's criminal world, and he had been on the verge of joining the Hells Angels himself. He had a friend inside the club, a hard, ambitious biker the two had come up alongside in the early 1980s, a man named Maurice Boucher. But when Cazzetta saw the club butcher its own brothers and sink them in the river to solve an internal problem, something in him closed the door for good. He judged Lennoxville an unforgivable betrayal of everything the outlaw code was supposed to mean, and he refused the patch. Instead, with his brother Giovanni, he built something of his own, a rival, a club that would never bow to the Angels. He called it the Rock Machine. His old friend Boucher took the other road. He took the patch and he began to climb. So the two men who would command the opposing armies of the bloodiest biker war in history started on the same side and split over a single question, whether a club that would murder its own could ever be trusted. One said no and built the enemy. One said yes and became the thing the other had feared. Everything that followed, every bomb, every body, every name on the death list, grew out of that fracture. The Quebec Biker War was a broken friendship, fought at the scale of a province. By the early 1990s, the Hells Angels in Quebec were no longer a motorcycle club in any ordinary sense. They were a corporation with a body count. At the bottom sat the puppet clubs, the rockers and others, street-level dealers and enforcers who did the dangerous work and took the arrests. Above them stood the full-patch chapters. And above everything, Boucher was building something new, an elite chapter with no fixed territory of its own, free to move across the whole province and command the rest. He called it the Nomads, and it would become the most feared unit in Canadian organized crime. At its peak, the Nomads pulled more than $100 million a year out of Montreal's cocaine trade alone. A single map later found in one biker's home showed the entire city carved into territories, every district assigned, with only one small corner left to the Mafia. That was the prize. Whoever controlled the street-level drug trade in Montreal controlled one of the richest criminal markets in North America, and Boucher intended to control all of it. The only thing standing in his way was the club his old friend had built. The Rock Machine held its own corners, ran its own product, and had no intention of paying tribute to the Hells Angels. And in 1994, the balance tipped because Salvatore Cazzetta, the one man whose authority held the Rock Machine together, was arrested and taken off the board. With the enemy suddenly leaderless, Boucher saw his moment. The Hells Angels issued an ultimatum to every independent dealer and rival crew in Quebec: submit to the Angels or be destroyed. The Rock Machine's answer came in a motorcycle shop. On July 13, 1994, 3 masked men walked into a custom motorcycle shop on Henri Bourassa Boulevard in the Rivière des Prairies district of Montreal. Inside, a 34-year-old named Pierre Dost was working. Dost wore the colors of the Death Riders, a Hells Angels support club, which made him, in the arithmetic of the ultimatum, a piece of the Angels' machine. The 3 men called out, and when they had him, they shot him dead among the bikes and the tools. It was the first killing of the war, and it was a message aimed straight at Boucher. The rock machine would not submit. It would fight. The Angels answered in kind almost immediately, and then they made it official. 2 days after Dost died, the senior Hells Angels of Quebec gathered at a hotel in Longueuil, and days later they moved through the club's fortified bunker in Sorel, chapter by chapter, to take a vote. Each chapter would decide whether to join the war. Police cameras were watching the bunker that day, filming the men coming and going, and at one point Maurice Boucher noticed the lens pointed at him. He did not flinch or turn away. He paused, looked directly into the camera, smiled, and waved. He already knew he was going to win. The vote passed. Every Hells Angels chapter in Quebec committed to the war under Boucher's leadership, and the killing became systematic. On October 28, 1994, a car bomb killed Sylvain Pelletier, the boss of a French-Canadian crew aligned with a rock machine, and the message was clear that the Angels would not limit themselves to guns. The rock machine and the independents drew together into a loose coalition they called the Alliance, and both sides dug in. Through the first year came the drive-bys, the clubhouse bombs, the disappearances, and by the war's first anniversary, the RCMP stood before the press and put a number on it: 30 dead already. In October 1995, Harold Pelletier, Sylvain's brother, walked into the RCMP and cut a deal, confessing a role in 17 murders, the first man to crack from the inside. It would not be the last crack, and it was nowhere near the most important, because by then the city still thought it was watching a war between criminals, a private slaughter that stayed within the underworld and touched no one who had not chosen it. That belief was about to die on a residential street, killed by the same thing that killed everyone else in this war: a bomb. Except this time, the person it killed was 11 years old. By the autumn of 1995, the war had stopped resembling a series of hits and started to look like a city tearing itself apart. In a single week that September, Montreal absorbed a spasm of violence that showed how completely the conflict had slipped its leash. A man was assassinated in a parking lot. Bombs went off at a strip club, a bar, and the mansion of an organized crime figure. Arsonists torched a pawn shop, a tanning salon, and a used car lot. Businesses caught up in the web of debts, fronts, and territory the two sides were fighting over. And in the middle of it came a moment that captured the sheer chaos of the thing: a friendly fire disaster in which bikers managed to kill 3 members of their own club by mistake. That was the war now. It was no longer contained to ambushes between rival gangs on quiet streets. It was bombs in public places, fires in commercial districts, and gunmen so eager and so sloppy that they were killing the wrong people, including their own. The bodies were piling up faster than the police could catalog them, and by the middle of the decade, the toll had climbed past 24 with no end in view. The Hells Angels were winning, grinding the rock machine down with superior numbers and money. But winning in this war did not mean the killing slowed. It meant the opposite. And the more chaotic it became, the more certain it was that sooner or later the violence would reach someone who had never signed up for any of it. It was a warm afternoon in Hochelaga Maisonneuve, a working-class corner of East Montreal, and Daniel Desrocher was 11 years old and walking with a friend near his home. Across the street, a man named Marc Dubé, a drug dealer of 26, climbed into his Jeep outside a biker hangout. Someone had hidden a bomb near the passenger seat. When it went off, it killed Dubé instantly, and it threw a fragment of the wrecked vehicle across the road, where it struck Daniel in the head. The boy suffered massive brain damage. He held on in a hospital bed for 4 days, and then he died. Daniel Desrocher had no connection to the Hells Angels, no connection to the rock machine, no connection to drugs or bikers or the war being fought around him. He was a child on a sidewalk. The bomb had not even been meant for him, and the men who built it were never identified. Because in this war, the killers of a child could simply melt back into a machine that protected them. But his death did something 150 gangland murders had not. It made the war personal to every parent in Quebec. Until that afternoon, the public had watched the bloodshed as someone else's problem, criminals killing criminals, a private slaughter behind a closed door. A dead 11-year-old kicked the door open. The province turned as one, and it turned in fury. And at the center of that fury stood the boy's mother, José-Anne Desrocher, who took her grief public and became the face of a crusade against the biker gangs, refusing to let Quebec look away. The Hells Angels understood exactly what she had become, and they tried to buy her. A man in a suit approached her with an envelope and a written pledge, $2 million for her silence. She told him she was an honest woman and did not want his dirty money. Years later, the offer came again, $3 million this time. She refused that too. She would die in 2005 of pneumonia, only 40 years old. And those who knew her wondered aloud whether the tragedy had shortened her life. Her son's death forced the state off the sidelines. On October 5th, 1995, the federal government, the province, and the city of Montreal jointly launched Operation Carcajou, Operation Wolverine, an elite task force pulling the best investigators from 3 police forces with a single mandate: to end the biker war and find the people who had killed Daniel Desrocher. For the first time, the war had a third combatant, and it was the state itself, which meant that Maurice Boucher now had a new enemy, one he could not bomb or outshoot. He could only try to make it afraid. Boucher's problem, by 1997, was not the rock machine. He was winning that war on the streets. His problem was that the state had learned to fight him with informants, men who wore the patch and then talked. And Boucher knew, from corrupt contacts inside the police, that there was already a mole somewhere in his own organization. He did not know the name, and a leak he could not find was more dangerous than any rival club, because it meant the war he was winning could still be lost, not on the street, but in a courtroom. So Boucher devised an answer of monstrous ambition. If the justice system was the weapon being used against him, he would terrorize the justice system itself. He would have his men murder its foot soldiers, prison guards, at random, for no reason except what they represented, until every guard, every prosecutor, every judge in Quebec understood that serving the state against the Hells Angels could get them killed. A system paralyzed by fear, he reasoned, could not process informants, could not run trials, could not touch him. On June 26, 1997, a prison guard named Diane Lavigne was driving home from work when 2 men on a motorcycle pulled alongside her van. One of them, a Hells Angels associate named Stéphane Gagné, opened fire, and Diane Lavigne died of 2 gunshot wounds, a woman murdered for the uniform she wore, and nothing else. Months later, on September 8th, Gagné and another man ambushed a prison bus, opening fire on the 2 guards aboard. Guard Pierre Rondeau was killed. His colleague Robert Corriveau survived. Neither man had done anything but show up to work. It was one of the most chilling strategies in the history of North American organized crime, an outlaw declaring war not on a rival, but on the state's ability to function. And for a while, it seemed to be working, because the man who ordered it was about to walk into a courtroom and walk back out a free man, more untouchable than ever. The murders of the guards were meant to be untraceable, random killings with no thread back to Boucher. But the thread existed, and his name was Stéphane Gagné. Known in the underworld as Godasse, Gagné was the Hells Angels associate who had shot Diane Lavigne and taken part in the ambush that killed Pierre Rondeau. a hardened striver who had killed for the club precisely because he believed it would earn him a full patch. In December 1997, the police arrested him, and they arrested him with enough evidence that he was staring down the certainty of dying in prison. That was the pressure point the whole case would turn on. Gagne was a career criminal and an admitted double murderer, exactly the kind of man whose word a jury distrusts. But he was also the one person alive who could put the orders in Boucher's mouth. Facing the rest of his life behind bars, he made the calculation that has broken every code in the outlaw world, and he agreed to talk. He told investigators that Boucher had ordered the guards killed to terrorize the justice system, and that Boucher had personally congratulated him afterward. He passed polygraph tests on his account. In exchange, the Crown dropped one of the murder charges against him, and Gagne became the state's weapon against the most feared man in Quebec. Everything now depended on whether 12 ordinary citizens would believe a killer. In 1998, Maurice Boucher went on trial for ordering the murders of Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau. The Crown's case rested on the man who had pulled the trigger, Stéphane Gagne, who had been arrested and had agreed to testify that Boucher gave the orders. It should have been enough. A confessed hitman, naming the boss who sent him. But Gagne was exactly the kind of witness a jury struggles to trust, a career criminal and admitted killer trading his testimony for a lighter sentence. And Boucher's defense hammered that mercilessly. Why would 12 citizens send a man to prison for life on the word of an assassin cutting a deal to save himself? In November 1998, they would not. Maurice Boucher was acquitted. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, and something worse than free. He walked out a legend. In the eyes of Quebec's underworld and much of its public, Boucher had done the impossible. He had ordered the assassination of state officials, gone to trial for it, and beaten the charge in open court. He was untouchable now in a way no gangster in the province's history had ever been, and he knew it. He embarked on a public relations campaign, moving through Montreal like a celebrity, dining in the open, letting himself be photographed, a man who had declared war on the justice system and won. The war on the streets ground on beneath him, the Nomads tightening their grip, the body still falling, and the king presided over all of it, apparently beyond the reach of any court in the country. And in the middle of that, in the year 2000, the war did something it had never done. It came for the press. Michel Auger was the most respected crime reporter in Quebec, a veteran of Le Journal de Montreal, who had spent decades chronicling the Mafia and the biker gangs, a man who knew the players by name and kept files on individual bikers at his own home. He had covered the entire war. On the morning of September 13th, 2000, around 11 o'clock, Auger drove into the newspaper's parking lot and was reaching into his trunk for his laptop when a gunman stepped up behind him and shot him 6 times in the back. The shooter fled, and Auger, lying on the pavement with bullets in his spine, pulled out his own cell phone and called for an ambulance. He lived. The bullets cracked 2 vertebrae and missed his spinal cord by millimeters, and the investigators drew a chilling conclusion about why he was still breathing. He had survived because the shooter was an amateur. A professional hit would have ended with bullets to the head, and Auger would have been dead in the parking lot. Somebody had wanted Quebec's most prominent crime journalist assassinated for what he wrote, and had very nearly managed it. Now look at what Quebec was staring at by the autumn of 2000. A child killed by a car bomb, 2 prison guards murdered for their uniforms, a journalist gunned down at his own office, and presiding over all of it, a Hells Angels leader who had been tried for murder and acquitted, moving through the city like he owned it, apparently untouchable. The whole apparatus of the state, the police, the courts, the press, had been attacked, and it was losing. The question hanging over the entire province was simple and desperate. Was there anything, anyone, that could bring Maurice Boucher down? There was. It had been sitting inside his own organization for 6 years, and it had just died in a garage. The man found dead in that garage in August 2000 was named Dany Kane, And to the Hells Angels, he was a nobody. A member of the Rockers, the Nomads Puppet Club, a hard, useful associate who ran errands, drove senior bikers around, killed when he was told to. He had murdered at least 2 people for the organization and supplied the explosives used in the deaths of 9 more. He was, on the surface, exactly the kind of expendable soldier the Angels burned through by the dozen. He was also, for nearly 6 years, a police informant, and the single most devastating one in Canadian history. The war had been leaking almost from its beginning, and this is the part the Hells Angels never saw. Go back to 1994. Kane had done everything the club asked and gotten nothing back, still stuck in the puppet club, never promoted to full Angel, watching men he considered lesser get patched ahead of him. He decided the club had used him, and he wanted revenge. On October 17, 1994, 3 months into the war, Kane picked up a phone and called the RCMP to offer his services. And on November 4th, he sat down with a handler for the first time. He was given a source number, 3683. And Dany Kane began to talk. What he delivered was staggering. He told his handlers about the club's business ties to the top of the Italian Mafia. He told them, before it fully existed, about Boucher's plan to build an elite chapter called the Nomads. For years he fed them the war from the inside, who was traveling where, who was meeting whom, who had killed whom, and who was marked to die next, the Angels' expansion plans, their weapons and explosives purchases. He was not a witness to the war. He was inside its command structure, reporting upward to the police in real time, while the Hells Angels believed their inner circle was sealed. Then the police made him something more dangerous still. They wired him. Kane began wearing a body pack, a hidden microphone taped to his torso, for as long as 14 hours at a stretch, and he walked it straight into the most secret rooms in the organization. The Hells Angels held meetings they called masses, gatherings in hotel rooms where the leadership discussed the killings and divided the drug money, the 10% tax each member paid into the common war chest. No outsider had ever penetrated a mass. Kane recorded them. He captured meeting after meeting on tape, the leadership of the Hells Angels discussing murder and money, filmed and recorded by the man they trusted to guard them. And he led the police to the money. For all its violence, the war was ultimately about cash, oceans of it, and the Nomads had built a machine to handle the flood of drug revenue pouring in from the streets of Montreal. Kane's intelligence pointed investigators to an ordinary-looking apartment on Beaubien Street, and from there they followed the couriers who shuttled bags of cash to a second flat nearby, on Place Montreal. One night, a sergeant slipped inside the second apartment to see what was there, and what he found belonged in a heist film. The closets were stacked waist-high with bags, so many that he later testified it looked like a castle built out of money bags. There was a safe he did not dare open for fear of scrambling the combination and tipping off the bikers. There were 2 counting machines. There were hundreds of rubber bands, the humble tool of an operation moving so much cash it had to be bundled by the machine load. This was the Nomads Bank, the financial heart of the entire Quebec Hells Angels, and later evidence would show it processing staggering sums, the tax and the profits of an empire, all flowing through 2 unremarkable apartments in a residential neighborhood. When the police finally got a wiretap warrant and installed a hidden microphone inside, the very first sound the microphone picked up, the moment it went live, was the whir of the counting machines running. The war had a heartbeat, and it was the sound of money being counted, and Dany Kane had led the police straight to it. But a man cannot live as 2 people forever. Kane was a Hells Angels killer and a police agent at the same time, a family man with a secret male lover, a hardened biker writing intimate confessions to his handlers, and the contradictions tore at him. He was still doing the club's dirty work to keep his cover, still driving senior nomads around Montreal, still watching himself get passed over and used, all while carrying the secret that could destroy them. He was paid well for it, his total arrangement with the police reaching well over $1 million, but the money could not resolve what he had become. In the summer of 2000, the police did something that captured the sheer strangeness of his position. Kane was invited to the wedding of a nomad, a lavish celebration held at Mom Boucher's own home, with famous Quebec singers performing for the outlaw elite. To protect his cover, his police handlers gave him $1,000 to bring as a gift. So Dany Kane walked into the enemy king's house, wearing the trust of men he was betraying, carrying a present paid for by the police. Days later, he was dead. On August 7th, 2000, they found him in his garage, in his car, gone from carbon monoxide, a note left behind. Officially, it was suicide, a man crushed by an impossible double life. And the note he left reads like exactly that. A cry from a man who no longer knew which of his selves was real. "Who am I?" it asked. "Am I a biker? Am I a policeman? Am I good or evil? Am I loved or feared? Am I exploited or the exploiter?" And yet, his family looked at his body and saw that his face had been badly beaten, an injury the peaceful death of carbon monoxide poisoning does not cause. He died weeks before he was to be paid out in full and given a new identity to vanish into, at the precise moment he had turned from the police's greatest asset into their greatest liability. A man who knew everything and was cracking under the weight of it. To this day, no one can prove what happened in that garage. His biographer called the suicide highly questionable. The most valuable informant in the history of the Canadian underworld died with the answer and took it with him. But he had already done the thing that mattered. For 6 years, Dany Kane had recorded the war from inside its own command. And even dead, the evidence he left behind was live, loaded, and pointed straight at Maurice Boucher. The shooting of Michel Auguer did something the deaths of guards and even a child had not quite done. It frightened the one power in Montreal that sat above the bikers. Vito Rizzuto, the head of the Montreal Mafia and the quiet arbiter of the city's entire underworld, watched the public fury over the Auguer attack and saw a real danger that the outrage would finally push the federal government to pass a sweeping anti-gang law, an American-style tool that could dismantle organized crime across Canada, Mafia included. The bikers' reckless war was threatening to bring the whole house down on everyone. So Rizzuto did what he had done for years to keep the peace and the profits flowing. He forced the two sides to the table. On September 27, 2000, Maurice Boucher met with Fred Faucher, the leader of the Rock Machine, in a courthouse in Quebec City, and the two men agreed to a truce, mediated by the most powerful crime boss in the country. For a moment, it looked as if the deadliest biker war in history might simply be negotiated shut by the Mafia. It did not hold. Within weeks, the violence resumed, the truce collapsing almost as soon as it was announced. And the failure carried a grim lesson. This war had grown beyond the control of the men who supposedly ran the underworld. Not the police, not the courts, and now not even Vito Rizzuto could switch it off. The only thing left that could end the Quebec Biker War was the total destruction of one side, and that was exactly what was coming. Dany Kane's death did not stop the machine he had built. By the time he died in August 2000, the police had another agent inside the war, and more importantly, they had years of Kane's recordings, his intelligence, and the trail he had drawn straight into the Nomads' bank. The war above ground was still raging. The Auguer shooting came just weeks after Kane's death, and behind the scenes, investigators were quietly assembling the largest organized crime case in Canadian history out of the material a dead informant had handed them. The final push had a trigger. In April 2000, Boucher's close friend and fellow nomad Norman Biff Hamel was murdered, and the investigation that followed, built on projects that had been running for years, gathered everything: the wiretaps, the surveillance, Kane's tapes of the masses, the financial records from the counting house. The numbers behind it were immense. Hundreds of thousands of intercepted communications, more than 1,000 surveillance operations. The state had spent years watching, listening, and recording, and now it was ready to move all at once. On March 28, 2001, it moved. In an operation called Springtime, more than 2,000 police officers fanned out across Quebec in a single coordinated sweep, hitting hundreds of locations and arresting scores of Hells Angels and their associates. including the leadership of the untouchable Nomads chapter. The elite unit Boucher had built to command the war was rounded up in one morning. The bank was seized. The tapes of the masses became evidence. Dozens of the men arrested would eventually plead guilty, and the drug empire that had run Montreal for a decade was gutted in a day. The war that had killed more than 150 people was, functionally, over, and the man who had presided over all of it was about to face the reckoning his 1998 acquittal had denied. Boucher's acquittal had never actually been the end of the guard's case. The Crown had appealed it, arguing the trial had gone wrong, and the Quebec Court of Appeal agreed, overturning the acquittal and ordering Boucher tried a second time for the murders of Diane Lavigne and Pierre Rondeau. So in the spring of 2002, the most feared man in Quebec walked back into a courtroom to face the same charges he had beaten 4 years earlier, except this time the ground had shifted beneath him. The war was lost, the Nomads were in prison, and the untouchable aura that had protected him was gone. At the center of the retrial, once again, stood Stéphane Gagné, the hitman who had pulled the trigger on the guards and then turned on his boss. The Hells Angels had done everything to keep him from testifying. They had offered him $1 million bribe to stay silent. They had burned down his parents' house as a warning and told him that next time his family would be inside it. Gagné testified anyway. He told the jury how Boucher had ordered the guards killed to terrorize the justice system, and how Boucher had congratulated him afterward. And this time, with the prosecutor France Charbonneau methodically building the case around him, the jury believed it. On May 6, 2002, Maurice "Mom" Boucher was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The man who had ordered the murder of state officials to make himself untouchable had been brought down by one of his own soldiers, testifying on the strength of a case a dead informant had made possible. The king of the Quebec Hells Angels went to a maximum security cell, and he never came out. He died there of throat cancer on July 10, 2022, at the age of 69. When the smoke cleared, the numbers were almost impossible to hold. More than 160 people dead across 8 years, over 200 injured, more than 80 bombings, some 130 arsons, 20 disappearances. Among the dead were at least a handful of people who had nothing to do with any of it, killed by mistaken identity, by crossfire, by a bomb meant for someone else. And one of them was an 11-year-old boy on a sidewalk whose death turned an entire province against the men who had killed him. The Hells Angels won the war. The rock machine, battered and outgunned, patched over to the Bandidos in 2001 in a bid to survive, and it was not enough. Hostilities died out by 2002, and in 2003, the Bandidos ceded Quebec to the Angels entirely. But it was the emptiest victory imaginable, because winning the war on the street was exactly what had drawn the full weight of the state down onto the club. The Angels beat the rock machine and lost their army to the courts. Later prosecutions like Operation Charcuterie would try to reach back and charge the whole chapter for the entire war, and parts of that effort would collapse under the sheer weight of the evidence and the delays. A fitting coda to a war that broke records even in its cleanup. And in the end, the whole thing closed the loop it had opened. It began in 1985 with the Hells Angels murdering their own brothers at Lennoxville, a betrayal so complete it drove one man to build the enemy in disgust. It ended with the Hells Angels destroyed from the inside by another of their own, a nobody in a puppet club who wore a wire for 6 years and filmed the masters of the war discussing their kills. The club that lived by loyalty was killed by betrayal twice at both ends of its bloodiest chapter. That is the Quebec Biker War, the deadliest gang conflict in Canadian history, fought with car bombs and anti-tank logic by men who treated an entire province as a battlefield and killed anyone, even a child, who got in the way. These were disciplined, organized, terrifyingly capable criminals at the peak of their power, which is what makes the other side of the outlaw world so hard to believe, because for every Mom Boucher who ran an empire, there was a biker who got caught because he wore his club shirt to the crime, or published a memoir while on the run, or blew up the wrong person and left his own blood at the scene. Click the next video to meet the biker criminals who were so bad at crime it became almost educational.